Just recently, my son and I rewatched one of our favorite movies, Omega Man, and that kind of inspired me to look at the source material and some of the other derivative movies that came from it. And so in this video, I'll be contrasting the book I Am Legend by Richard Matheson, the Vincent Price movie, The Last Man on Earth, the Charlton Heston movie, Omega Man, and the Will Smith movie, I Am Legend. And what's probably also be interest to a lot of people is virtually all of our modern ideas on zombie apocalypse come from this book, or at least this is the first time it's ever been done. George Romero credits this as his inspiration. He said originally he wrote a short story pretty much in the I Am Legend world, which he eventually would convert over to his zombie ideas. Now, to give a little bit of context, because I know a lot of people are tend to be kind of snobby about books, where it's like, oh, only the book is good, and blah blah blah. I'm not always that way. I can be that way, but I'm not always that way. I did see Omega Man first as a preteen. I absolutely loved the movie at the time, and it's always been something I've enjoyed every time I take an opportunity to rewatch it again. And obviously, my son decided he really liked that movie as well. Then I saw the movie The Last Man on Earth, the one with Vincent Price, when I was an adult. And it's like, okay, I can see where it came from. It's a little bit not quite as it's not quite as a grabby of a movie, and so it made me decide to read I Am Legend, the book. And reading the book, I'm like, oh wow, it's like, yeah, definitely neither of the two movies at that time had captured the essence of it. Even though I still like Omega Man, it's like, yeah, this book it's really decent horror that no one has really tapped into properly. And then lastly, I saw Will Smith's I Am Legend, which shares the same name as the book. And that's about it. So, if you just talk a little bit about what I like as horror, so that when I'm talking about things, you know where I'm coming from, so that you know my likes and dislikes ahead of time, so you know what's going to be a turn on and a turn off for me in terms of horror. Uh, I like the idea in horror of an overarching dread or angst, where it's just this wall of despair kind of over everything. I like seeing the human element, where you can see people acting more or less as you would expect them to act in the situation, desperately trying to cope with something that appears to be, or they are actually coping, but at least on the surface, it seems to be completely beyond their control to overcome. And essentially, in the end, the best thing they can do is figure out how to survive it and live with it. Uh, that's the kind of thing I like. Now, I don't mind if all the characters end up dead in the end because that means the stakes are always high. In far jump scares aren't a big thing for me. I mean, in a proper place in a movie, a jump scare can be a nice thing. But if the movie is completely dependent on it, if the whole movie is just blah, 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 doesn't do anything for me. I can skip those all day long. Uh, Body horror, it's not the main attraction to me. If you're there to just watch blood and guts, yeah, that's not my thing. But it doesn't bother me. Because the thing is if body horror is used properly, it helps tell the story. It makes it real. It makes like the seem like the things going on. I mean, if you know the blood and guts in a Romero movie may not look particularly realistic, but you can suspend belief and your disbelief and go, okay, yep, yep, yep. I need because in a situation like this, it would be gory and awful and horrible. So I'm not opposed to body horror. I just if it's the main attraction, then it's not what I necessarily want to see. I can almost always mentally paper over uh, poor uh, effects in a movie. I mean, I understand budgeting and everything like that, and not every movie, gets millions of dollars to work with, and a lot of movies that get millions of dollars to work with suck anyway. So I'm very generous in terms of waving away effects if they don't take me too far out of the story, and if I understand it's just there to help me along to understand what's going on. If the story is compelling, I can pretty much overlook them. And I'll warn you when I'm going to get to spoiling things, but at the moment, I've got a little bit more narrative before I start spoiling things. In short, I really liked the book, and even though it wasn't the first thing I read, Omega Man, the movie with Charlton Heston, is a product distilled from both the book and the first movie, The Last Man on Earth. It veers strongly from the source material, but it stands fairly well as its own thing, and clearly couldn't exist without the source material that it reinterpreted. The Last Man on Earth, the one with Vincent Price, superficially displays many, if not almost all, the elements in the book. The few areas where it departs causes some massive issues with the movie. As a B movie and movie that was basically produced by and mostly starred by Italians, uh, it's just low budget enough where the combination of the aesthetics and the deviations really wound the movie. Will Smith's I Am Legend is a really bad attempt to take the elements of both the previous movies and the book and try to pack them all together as one thing. It tries to borrow things as kind of an homage, and it just fails really badly. All right, so now we're going to get into the spoiler section. So we're going to actually talk about what happens in these things. So if you're going to cut out here because you might watch these, I highly recommend Omega Man. I highly recommend the book. Um, I lightly recommend The Last Man on Earth because you can kind of see it's one of those movies where you watch and go, wow, what could have been? But you have to have the book to see. So you go, oh, wow. If they would have, and part of it is there's things in the book that they could not do in the 60s that I think would have made it a lot better. But, anyways, spoiling away. I Am Legend. So essentially, what we're dealing here is with a vampire apocalypse. It's a wind-borne plague, and it's been a little while since I've actually read the book, but I don't think they get into the absolute details of what happened, how it happens. Uh, so most of the population is infected by this vampire disease. And interestingly enough, they do a good job. Almost every aspect from a legendary vampire shows up in these people who have the vampire disease. And they have a lot of interesting explanations for why these attributes are true. For example, they discover that these infected people hate garlic, and it turns out that the disease, the bacteria that are infecting them, uh, are completely vulnerable to bacteria. And so, almost as like a host like reaction, the vampires stay away from garlic because it'll hurt them. And the vampires are actually, they are undead. They do die, they do come back. These vampires are intelligent and fast moving. Bullets don't have effect on them. And then something else they explain with the disease, but I'll leave that in case you decide to read a book because I thought a lot of things he came up with for describing this vampire disease are clever. Stakes do kill the vampires. One of the things that's really powerful in the book is they surround his house every night. And there's like unbelievable horde of these things. And since they're intelligent, they call out to him. They know him by name. There's parts where he's peeking out, and essentially the female vampires are undressing themselves and exposing themselves and kind of taunting, "Hey, come out! You got to be lonely." Blah blah blah. It's all this time, and it's to me, it's haunting. I mean, it doesn't come across. It comes across far more horrific than erotic. Uh, So the vampires keep him bottled up at night, and while they're yelling and taunting him, he basically cranks the music up to try to drown them out. And then by day, he hunts them down and kills them, finding out, or they sleep and staking them. The main character is alive. He suspects, he isn't 100% sure, but he was bit by a vampire bat when he was stationed in Panama, and he believes he caught an early version of the disease and essentially gained an immunity to it. The character is a factory worker, and so he's not some super intellect, and he's trying to study the disease. And there's examples of him like getting books from the library and borrowing microscopes and stuff from laboratories and bringing it in. And he's discovering things about the disease, but it's far beyond his skill to come up with a cure. And I think this is a really strong part of the book where you realize that he's going through these motions of looking at the disease and trying to deal with it, and he actually has no hope of overcoming it because he doesn't have the intellect. It's not his area of expertise. He might be able to nibble around the edges and discover some of the things that are true about it, but he's not going to figure out how to overcome it. And that's part of the dread that's upon him and you as the reader, uh, because of the situation. He's, I believe, 3 years into this apocalypse. He's become an alcoholic. He's clearly unraveling, and uh, he has flashbacks with when he had to deal with his family members when the disease hits. Now, yeah, so I won't go a little further than that. Uh, he does run across a dog, and the dog is sick, and he's trying to nurse it back to health, but it's not in good shape. And he's desperate to try to get so he can have some kind of companionship, and ends up dying. And then he meets up with a woman, and then he discovers that there are others out there. And what it is these others are infected as well, and they have some of the symptoms. For instance, they have an aversion to light, but they don't have most of the other problems the actual vampires have. And what he discovers is she's there to spy on him, because what he's been inadvertently doing is during the day, he's been killing all these people he's seeing. Some of them are vampires, and some of them are others. So the others want to take him out. He discovers what he's done. He and the woman, not truly intimate, but have a moment together. And ultimately, he ends up being captured by the others, and he's set up to be executed for all the murders he's committed on them. By the way, they don't get along with the vampires either. They're at war with them as well. And the girl feels pity for him and ends up giving him suicide pills so he can take himself out. And before the book ends, he muses at the idea that, it almost kind of in a chuckling way, that he's now going to become this legendary boogeyman to these people. Long after he's dead, the stories will be there about this legendary beast who was amongst them, killing them while they slept. So thus the name I Am Legend. So it seems almost, because his life's been so horrible for the last several years, he's almost kind of happy to go out, that it's over. And at the same time, he kind of sees himself living on as this legend. So now we talk about the movie The Last Man on Earth, starring Vincent Price. Um, so interestingly, this movie was also co-written by the author of the book, Richard Matheson. Uh, Matheson was not happy with Vincent Price as the main character. He didn't think he pulled the character off properly. And by the time the movie was all over, the author so disliked the final product that he appears as a pseudonym under a pseudonym as the writer. So he was not happy with it, which says a lot, especially if you're working on it. I thought Price did a fairly good job considering the material he was given. There's a particular scene in the movie that I thought his acting skills were really good. He's watching a home movie of his family, and there's a point where they're at the circus, and there's a bunch of clown scenes, and he starts chuckling, and then he starts laughing harder and harder to where it's almost hysterical laughter. And in the middle of the hysterical laughter, it starts breaking down into crying. And I thought it was a pretty powerful scene. And so the thing is, I think Vincent Price had the chops to do this. I don't think he had good material. Now, back to the author, he wrote a really good book, but not every author can write a screenplay. And so that probably was the issue here. We ended up with a company that was B movie quality, and the author wasn't adept at doing screenplays, and we kind of end up with a product that wasn't as good as the book at all. Many elements of the book really come through strongly. I mean, you can see it paralleling the book and mirroring it throughout. But they made several big changes that, in my opinion, kind of alter the overall feel. So, one of the things they did was they made the main character a research scientist. And I think this is a really big mistake because I thought one of the things that made the book work was the idea that the character can't fix this. Once you fully realize, because initially you're watching the character kind of bumble around the microscopes and you're thinking, oh, okay, he's going to work on this and fix it. Then you realize, oh no, he doesn't have the intellect to do this. And even if he was fully up to par, he's unraveling and he's not capable of doing this. So you get kind of the tease where Vincent Price's main character might be able to actually overcome this. Uh, the vampires are more like zombies. Only one seems to really be able to talk, and pretty much all he keeps saying is calling them by name, saying, and they use a different name for the main character to call him Morgan instead of Neville. They keep saying, Morgan, come out, Morgan, come out. And it's not as strong. It's not like the taunting you get in the book. It really doesn't capture the full creepiness of it. I mean, there's moments. It's actually all the moments are on the inside with him kind of dealing with it, like cranking up the music and drinking more and stuff like that. And but when you pan outside, you essentially see these slow moving zombies and a cast of a half dozen. There's a scene where he ends up getting home late and is confronted, and it's really poorly executed. It's a fight scene. It doesn't come off well. It should have been a real tense moment, but it's almost to the point where it's so poorly done you just kind of shrug your shoulders. Uh, Similar to the book, he does have the dog encounter and pretty much goes as the book. And then he encounters a woman, similar to how the book goes. And but the problem is, so at this point, there's her character and all the characters that are portrayed by the others, the people who aren't vampires but are infected. Um, they don't do a real good job carrying their part. You can tell English is a second language, and there's a point where he actually cures her with a blood transfusion. It ends with the others chasing him down, and they actually corner him in a church, and they end up killing him with a spear. Uh, the main character has a more confrontational ending rather than his more cerebral one in the book, where he ends up calling them freaks and claiming himself as the last man on Earth as he's dying. Um, and again, I see this movie as a watch it to get an idea what could have happened with the book. I would not watch this movie without reading the book first. Omega Man you can watch without reading the book, but this one I'd read the book before. Just my opinion. So then we get on to Omega Man. A couple of things to keep in mind is we're dealing with a different era for acting. So we have Charlton Heston kind of almost channeling a little bit of William Shatner here. But I think it's very apropos for this because essentially he's carrying the whole movie for a good chunk of it, where it's only him. And so you need him to be just a little bit over the top. Uh, One thing is about his character is very, very different from the original book and The Last Man on Earth, is he is ultra stoic. I mean, he's having issues with loneliness and all this, but he's dealing with it a lot better. Um, I think something that actually is a positive to this book is the 70s aesthetic because it was shot in the 70s. And there's a lot of issues that come up with the tech at the time that creates really good story elements that you just can't do with a modern movie because the gadgets don't work the same way and you don't get the same impact. I'll explain that in a moment. So the producers of this movie wanted to steer away from the term vampire because at that point vampires were becoming very cliched and they didn't think most people would be into it. So they're disease survivors instead. Uh, they have a few of the attributes of vampires. One of their biggest ones is their eyes work so horribly in light that they can't come out in daylight, and essentially floodlights keep them at bay. They can be shot and killed. And so what happens is this is a disease that comes out of a bio war between, I believe it was China and Russia. And the disease tends to kill most people, especially the elderly, and makes the others into mutants. Almost sounds like a replay of 2020, huh? The mutants, you know, again, I was saying that how they have their attributes. This one's showing them wearing sunglasses because even in modest light, they have problems seeing. Uh, they are fully into. Some of them are fully intellectual. Others are followers, but they all have intellect. Uh, they have the full capabilities of a human being, but because of what's happened, they despised the technology. So they essentially become these Luddites who are out there. They want to kill our main character, Neville, because he represents the old world that did this to them, that caused them to have these horrible mutations. And at the same time, they loathe technology. So guns are off limits to them. So it gives the, it makes sense. They carry it forward where it doesn't seem um, like a convenient description. It seems like they really believe that the only way they can make things work is to get rid of this guy, not using modern technology, or otherwise they are basically debasing themselves. Um, so this gives the character a realistic edge because he doesn't fear using technology. And essentially, the mutants function as almost a cult that call themselves the family. Uh, and I think the structure works really good in this movie. The main character, and they decided to go the research scientist route in this one. Um, he ends up in a situation where he's on the verge of death because the disease has hit him. And He's basically carrying a batch of different research serums, experimental. And in order to basically not die, he just picks one at random and shoots himself up with it. And it turns out they that is the cure, but much too late. Heston and this movie have a lot of really great bits. And again, if you're thinking of watching this movie, you should stop now because I'm going to give these bits away. But if you've watched it already or you're never going to see it, just listen along. So we have one example where he's driving into town, pulls up to a theater that's showing the marquee shows that the movie Woodstock is playing. Hops out of his car, goes in, fires up a generator that he's obviously set up there, runs the projector, and is sitting in the audience. And as the movie is going along, he's kind of turning his head and he's got a little smile on his face. It's almost kind of a sick look on his face. Like, it's just like, I can't, but he needs, this is the only human interaction he can get is all these people swarming around being interviewed in this movie on Woodstock. And there's points where he starts kind of mumbling along with the movie because he's watched it so many times. And I think this is a really good example of how the 70s aesthetic gives it something that other things wouldn't have. Because in a modern movie, he wouldn't be stuck with a character who'd only have one movie he could watch because that's the only movie at the theater and the amount of effort he had to do to make the theater functional just to watch this movie day after day after day um, wouldn't work in the modern age just because of DVDs and other things like that. Another thing is there's a point where he's walking out into an intersection. It's at daylight, so he doesn't have to worry about the bad guys. And all of a sudden, he starts hearing phones ringing, and he's looking at um, the pay phones on every corner, and it's just this wave of ringing and ringing, and finally he realizes that can't be happening, so he starts screaming, "There are no phones ringing!" Again, great with the 70s aesthetic. It shows that he's under a lot of mental strain and pressure, but he's very stoic with dealing with it. Uh, there's another bit where he's driving like a maniac through the city in a sports car, and he hits the curb too hard and destroys the wheel of the car, and goes walking off to a dealership and ends up having this imaginary conversation with the dealer trying to cut a deal on the new car he wants to take out of there. Um, Works pretty well. And then there's also a point where he's at his home residence. He's playing chess with a bust of Caesar and talks to him incessantly about things and has that kind of asking a question almost as if he's hearing an answer, but you don't never quite know if he does. Um, I think Heston really shines in this role. So in the movie, he ends up discovering the others. These are different. So they've been lying low because he's been running around shooting up the place and they're scared to death they're going to get caught in the crossfire. And of course, they don't get along with the mutants who are fully over. The others are experiencing the earliest symptoms of the disease and what's been happening to them at a certain point, typically when they get a little bit older. They all eventually go over to the other side. They distrust him, but they slowly warm up to them when they realize that he's not a bad guy and he can actually cure them. And the movie ends with him dead by a spear, uh, borrowed from the last man on Earth, and he ends in kind of a crucifixion like pose. And he manages to save a few bottles of blood and gives it over to the others, presumably so they can cure themselves, and so they kind of portray it as this sacrifice on behalf of the others. Um, it's not at all. I mean, in most respects, it's not like the book. but it's kind of great as its own thing. And at the same time, it seems really respectful of the book. The elements it does borrow from it and the movie, it's clearly they're saying, hey, we know where we're getting this from, but we're really kind of doing our own thing at the same time. And now Will Smith's I'm Legend. I'm sure you picked up by now on my tone that I am not thrilled with this movie. I thought it was an abomination. Um, Essentially, what they end up doing is they borrow from the book, they borrow from The Last Man on Earth, they borrow from Omega Man, and they kind of slap it all together and then do their own thing on top of it. And so, I mean, I see a lot of sins. One, if you're going to take the if you're going to be ballsy enough to make a movie with the exact title of the book, you should be following the book a lot more closely. Yeah, you can modernize it, you can do what you need to do, but this is so far away from the book, it's ridiculous. Whereas, so I would say The Last Man on Earth and Omega Man were showing deference to the original source material by not using the original name, saying, okay, yeah, we didn't quite make the book, but we're heavily inspired by it. And this movie doesn't come off as much as inspired as it as you get the feeling like, okay, we're writing a zombie movie, and here it is. And Will Smith might not be enough to sell it, so let's grab let's grab a title that a lot of people know of. So we'll create some buzz. I Am Legend. So we borrowed it. It's okay, now that we've decided that we're going to try to cash in on the name, now we're going to grab these elements from the other sources and pack them into the movie and just kind of shove them in place and go, okay, look, see, we recognize the other movies. And it doesn't seem respectful. It really seems cash grabby to me. Uh, One of the things that's really, and it's awful and doesn't make any sense whatsoever. So there's a scene where Will Smith's character meets up with a woman and her child, and the child has Shrek playing on a DVD player on the TV, and all of a sudden Will Smith sees it, and he like locks in and gets like emotionless and starts like repeating verbatim exactly what's going on in the video. Okay, okay, obviously they're trying to borrow from Omega Man and to a lesser extent the other two books, but it doesn't make any sense because if he has access to DVDs and he's in New York City, he probably has access eventually to virtually everything that's ever been put to DVD. So the idea he's been watching Shrek so much that he has it memorized is kind of silly. And the fact that he kind of lapses into it once he has companionship is it just doesn't make sense. It doesn't fit. Whereas Charlton Heston's character is quoting along with a movie because he believes he's the only functional human left, and this is the only companionship he's going to get. And here is Will Smith getting buggy about watching an animated Shrek movie, which, again, none of it makes sense. I despise hyper zombies. I define hyper zombies as human beings who get some kind of disease that are now, can run faster than a car, uh, can basically pick people up and throw them 100 yards and can run on the ceiling like a spider. It never makes any sense to me. It's just it's sloppy. It's a definite attempt to uh, latch into an idea. It's like, okay, well, one particular, well, it's a director who says, huh, zombies are kind of scary. But I bet if we make them a little bit more of this and a little bit more of this and a little bit more of this and a little bit more, they'll be even more scary. Showing that they don't understand what made zombies, vampires, or mutants scary in the first place. And they kind of abuse the whole dog trope because the dog is his companion throughout the entire thing. And gosh darn, if is there any way we could figure out what's going to happen to this dog? And this book, or excuse me, this movie, the others, the people who are infected but not going completely over, they don't really fit the mold of the other groups in the book and the other movies. The others, they don't fit in. They don't make. They're not. For instance, so the book and The Last Man on Earth are essentially treating the infected as a transition to a new species. Omega Man, to a certain extent, there's a hint that it's almost a transit. It's almost like a generational handover. Um, this, the others are nobody in particular, so there's no theme to it. It's weak. And Will Smith is like the ultimate research scientist. Has all the comforts of home, everything a research lab could have. He can do anything and everything. He doesn't run into any problems in terms of the things in his lab. Whereas going back to like the book where the guy isn't a research scientist at all, which I think is the most powerful character. Vincent Price's character um, can't achieve a whole lot despite being a research scientist. And even Charlton Heston, who's pretty up on his game, is having a hell of a time keeping anything together. Whereas Will Smith's lab is state of the art. Yeah, it's just it's an ugly attempt to shoehorn into what's going on in the previous iterations. And then in the ending, he realized the monsters can think, and now he's the monster to them. And he dies, but gets the cure to the people who need it. So it basically just takes all the themes that were advanced in the book and the other movies, and just throws them in a big can and kicks them over a cliff. Um, it's really mushy. Um, so I mean, the world could do without this movie, and I have an understanding that they're working on a sequel. Oh joy! And I bet you they're going to desperately try to fix all the problems, but I don't see how they do that. I won't be seeing it uh, unless I get really bored one night and hop aboard my wooden ship and hoist sails to go take a look. But I don't see it. All right, so a lot of stuff here. So in the comment section below, which one of these have you seen? Do you have a favorite amongst them? Do you think I'm being too harsh on I Am Legend? Is Omega Man uh, two 70s and two Charlton Heston for most modern people to watch? Uh, just curious on your thoughts on that if you have any. Please smash the like button. If the YouTube algorithm brought you here and you're not a regular subscriber, please consider subscribing. My videos are very eclectic, everything from politics to history to philosophy to economics and culture. And if you know somebody who might find this interesting, please consider sharing it with them. I appreciate you spending the time with me this evening. Hope to see you again in a future video.